He had closed the deal at midnight, a kind of win that in another life might have justified absence. A new tower, a green-lighted acquisition, the sudden sheer of numbers that move markets. He walked in with his phone still warm from calls, the leather of his briefcase creasing against the marble. The house was everything success had promised. A double-height foyer, polished floors that reflected crystal chandeliers, a kitchen like a showroom, sleek counters, a bowl of imported citrus, a piccolo espresso machine blinking back at him. He expected silence, maybe the soft click of the television downstairs, the hum of staff doing the rounds. He did not expect the sound the house made that night, small, broken, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping thing. He found her in the kitchen, crouched on the cold tile, knees tucked to her chest, a plastic bowl at her side. She was stirring the dog's kibble with the flat of her hand as if it were porridge, bringing handfuls to her mouth like a child learning how to feed herself for the first time. The sound of the dry pieces crunching under her teeth was obscene in that room of quiet wealth. He stood frozen on the threshold, the polished world he had built suddenly obscene. Sophia looked up. For a second, the two of them simply stared at each other, one man in the prime of his public life, one small girl reduced to scavenging from a pet bowl. He had legally adopted her 3 years earlier after a messy custody arrangement in another city. She had become, in press releases and condolence speeches, the private joy no one doubted he deserved. In photographs, she had been the softener of his harsh angles, a school ribbon here, paint on her hand there. In the single, suspended second in that cold kitchen, he felt the distance between image and reality split open. "Daddy," she whispered. It was as if the word itself were a question she had been practicing to ask but never had the courage to finish. Somewhere behind him, a door clicked. Letitia stepped into the kitchen as if she had been standing there all along, calm, measured, the smile already in place. She wore the house like a garment, the soft cashmere of someone who had always been entitled to rooms and silences. Her hands were empty. Her tone was the same one she used at cocktail parties when dismissing gossip. "She must be hungry," she said, the sort of observation that pretended to be charity. "She waits for the sitting times. You know how she holds to a routine." His voice sounded strange to himself when he finally found it. "Why is she eating this?" He gestured at the bowl. The kibble glittered in the overhead light, ridiculous, undignified. Letitia's smile hardened into reproach, and then softened into concern in the same breath. "You've been traveling." She gets confused. "I told her not to. She knows the rules." Perhaps she was curious. You know children.
He looked at Sophia's small hands, the knuckles white from the way she'd gripped the plastic scoop. Her wrists were thin under sleeve cuffs. There was a smudge of something dark at the corner of her mouth. He imagined every possible explanation: picky eating, a dare, a scene exaggerated by a tired child. He had built his life on closing gaps with facts. Tonight, facts did not come. Sophia spoke up again, in that small voice that belonged to children and secrets. "I was so hungry, I didn't want to make noise." It was a sentence that contained in its modesty a small disaster. He bent down as if gravity had changed, close enough to see the small bites missing from a plate that might normally have sat somewhere else. Her eyes were bright with a kind of shame that had nothing to do with mischief. They were the eyes of a child practicing disappearance. Her hair smelled faintly of lemon soap. There was a faint bruise, pale and almost perfectly round, on the underside of her arm, half hidden by sleeve creases. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was shock and the beginning of something much heavier. She shrugged. "She said it was my fault for being naughty," Sophia said. "She said I'd be hungry if I didn't behave." The billionaire took in the room, open plan, spotless, appliances that cost more than some people's cars. There were fresh roses in a vase, and the evening paper folded on the counter. In the living room, a framed family portrait smiled down. Him, Sophia on his lap, Letitia leaning in as if the three of them had always been a single photograph. The photograph that had been taken for reasons of image now felt like proof that things had been arranged for the cameras. His name had weight. It bought him charity and people who answered when he called. It also bought him distance, an unremarked permission to be absent. He had traveled, yes, and for reasons that once had seemed urgent. Boards needed to be impressed, contracts needed signatures. A decade of absence had not been criminal. It had been simply his life. Standing in that kitchen, he felt the sharp reorientation of priorities, like the sudden decanting of a liquid from one container to another. Letitia's voice cut through the moment with practiced lightness. "We'll talk when you're not exhausted," she suggested. "These things are complicated, you know that." Her eyes were a challenge and a command. He could see the calculation behind the civility. Keep the conversation compartmentalized, keep the public perfect, keep the narrative so there was no crack for the truth to slip through. He thought of all the quiet afternoons he had missed, the school plays he had not attended because a meeting had been scheduled across an ocean. He thought of the press release announcing Sophia's adoption, the handshakes, the suits.
He thought of the small paper crown he had kept on his desk from a party they had attended months earlier, an ornament he had meant to frame and never found time to. The night stretched. He sat with Sophia on the cold countertop, hands wrapped around the warmth of a travel mug he had asked the staff to bring, while she described in clipped sentences the days organized into measured rituals. Wake up, breakfast, lessons, screen time, dinner. Her words were careful, like someone rehearsing a play she had been made to perform. She spoke about scheduled snacks, about times she was allowed in the kitchen. Her voice dropped when she spoke about being told to stay in her room for long stretches. The house, for all its openness and light, had become a set of locked compartments. He went through the rooms as if cataloging a crime scene, without yet knowing the crime. Sophia's bedroom was tidy, too tidy, the kind of order that comes from someone always being watched. Her toys were lined up in a manner that suggested display rather than play. In a shallow drawer he found piles of drawings tucked into an envelope marked with her name. He opened one, and almost immediately his breath lodged in his chest. The drawings were minute, made with a child's hand, but with a dark perpendicularity to them that was unnerving. Stick figures and small houses, a single figure outside a fenced square, a door with a padlock. One drawing had words in a looping, shaky hand. "I eat the dog because no one hears me." Another said, "I don't want to wake Daddy." There were pictures of a woman with a frown, of a child with thin arms. The drawings read like a map of loneliness. He did not know where guilt ended and responsibility began. He made a call that shook him more than he expected, because it was finally doing exactly what he had been paying others to do for years. Dr. Eduardo answered, the lawyer who had negotiated prenuptial agreements and handled corporate filings. He listened without flinching, the kind of steady professional who knew how to separate alarm from strategy. "You need to come now," the billionaire told him. His voice had the taut, wired quality of someone who had just been struck and was still breathing in the impact. "She is in the kitchen. She was eating the dog's food." There was a pause. In that breath, Dr. Eduardo did something that was both legal and humane. He began to put a plan into words. "Stay with her," he said. "Do not let anyone remove her from your sight. Photograph everything. Do not confront Letitia alone. I'll come straight away." The list of tasks was procedural and exact, a map to sanity. He felt slightly ridiculous following instructions on how to secure a mobile phone's location log, how to photograph injuries without contaminating the scene, how to make a contemporaneous record of statements. Yet he followed them, because the instructions created a rhythm beneath the chaos. There is a peculiar comfort in process. He took pictures with the steady hand of someone who had done this before. Photographs of the bowl, of Sophia's hands, of the drawings, of the bruises he could now see more plainly when he called up the light. When Dr. Eduardo arrived, he did not look shocked. He looked like someone who had expected a day like this for an unpredictable but possible client. They sat at the kitchen island with 2 coffees, and he watched Sophia play with a stray piece of kibble between 2 fingers. Letitia stood nearby, wearing the expression of someone who had been caught and was eternally surprised to be so. "She's inventive," Letitia offered. "Children test boundaries." The words were too social, too flat. They did not carry the stain of what had actually occurred. "Where were you today?" he asked. "I was with the children's tutor," she said. "We were doing enrichment. I would never—" Her voice trembled with a practiced sincerity that made it impossible to tell if the tremor was real. "You need to rest. You're exhausted from travel." He could see the wheels turning, even as he felt his own turning in a different direction. A quiet calamitous focus on evidence. What was needed was not rhetoric but record. He called Mariana, Sophia's teacher. She arrived 15 minutes later, clutching a folder thick with patience and patience. She was the kind of teacher who kept notes like a ledger of small sorrows. "I noticed she stopped bringing snacks," Mariana told him. "At school she's quieter. She used to draw suns and now she draws locks. She's lost weight in the last semester. It's subtle but real." Mariana handed over a sheaf of papers.
Notes about Sophia's social interactions, copies of drawings from class, small comments about frequent absences from morning activities. There was also a note that chilled him, a line of Sophia saying, in a playtime whisper, that she sometimes goes hungry at night. The institution where the girl learned to say numbers and glue stars to paper had for months been registering decline. He needed more. He needed proof that did not live inside a home with a polished floor and a framed family portrait. He needed accounts from witnesses who had no reason to invent. He called Carmen, a former housekeeper who had left under circumstances the billionaire now recalled as uncomfortable minor quarrels. Carmen arrived quietly, tucking her apron bag into a chair as if she had been expected. Carmen's face was lined in ways only life can write. She spoke in the sort of low voice that carries memories like treasures too heavy to display with abandon. "I used to hide a sandwich in Sophia's drawer when I could," she said without looking at Letitia. "Just once. When the lady asked me why I did that, I told her it was love. She looked at me like I'd reshaped the truth." Other names followed.
João, a former driver, gave a terse affidavit about seeing Sophia at the back door late at night, peering into the courtyard as the staff cleared plates and locked gates. Maria Helena, who had worked as a temporary nanny, told them that Leticia had once instructed her not to give Sophia seconds, and that she had been told to restrict meals for disciplinary reasons. Each testimony was a small, crucial tile that, laid together, began to suggest a pattern. He did not want to be the kind of father who built a case like a corporation building a legal defense, but the legal apparatus had to be engaged if he was to protect a child inside his house. There was no time for indignant speeches. There was time for careful, immutable records. Photographs, witness statements, medical documentation. The pediatrician he called, Dr. Patricia, was a woman whose bedside manner was as crisp as a white coat, but whose eyes held the tenderness required to read children's bodies for the language of pain. She arrived with a small bag and a clinical neutrality that men like him often mistook for indifference until they saw it transmute into care. In the quiet of a makeshift exam room, she assessed Sophia without theatricality. A height chart, the angle of a shoulder, the pale callus beneath a fingernail. Her fingers pressed gently against a rib, and then away. "This is not an accident," she said softly. "There are signs consistent with neglect. Low weight for age, some healed bruising. Behavioral signs, too. Avoidant gaze, hypervigilance." She did not use the word abuse lightly. She used it like an instrument, measuring, precise. "We'll get blood work, a full charting, and a formal report. You'll need a psychologist to do an assessment in a protected setting." He listened. He did not need the words to make the situation real. Her clinical calm was confirmation, a legal and medical access he could not manufacture by himself. He arranged for lab work and for Sophia to meet a child psychologist that afternoon in a room not inside his home. The psychologist, Dr. Ana Lua, specialized in child testimony and trauma. She spoke of protocols, how to record statements in ways that would stand in court and would not re-traumatize a child. He felt, in that moment, the thickness of the machinery of protection, not the flashy parts that made news, but the painstaking protective work that actually shielded a small life. There was a small ritual he had not expected, a sliver of redemption that began at the end of that first long night. He sat at the low table in Sophia's room, and the two of them made pancakes. It was awkward at first, his hands too big, his timing off. She laughed at a batter catastrophe, and in that laugh was a break in the tension, a fragile thing like glass catching light. He scraped syrup on a plate and sat across from her at the tiny table big enough only in memory.
He asked her about her favorite colors, about a book she liked, about the girl she used to be before adult definitions had reshaped those edges. "You know," Sophia said between bites, "when we drew before, I drew a sun. Now my suns have too many lines." "Maybe we can draw a new sun together," he said. It felt like an immense promise, and perhaps it was nothing, but it was something real. He gave her a new box of crayons, and she hugged the pack to her chest. That clutching was its own language. Later, when she drifted off in his arms, exhausted and small, he stood by the window and watched the city burn delicate under the night. He had wealth, he had influence, he had money that could buy comfort and legal firepower. He had, until that day, underinvested in the only project that mattered now. He imagined the calls he would have to make, the PR team to manage potential fallout, the security detail to be briefed on privacy, the restructuring of trips. All of it seemed suddenly simple compared to the thinness of a little girl's wrist. The next morning, he filed a protective order. The paperwork was clean, the language legal and exact. He did it not as theater, but to create a buffer of law between Sophia and any situation that left her small and hungry. He took out the portrait that had held them together and put it away in a drawer. The public photograph had its uses, image and reputation, but right now it served only to remind him what he had been missing. But the story did not stay private for long. Letitia, as he had suspected, moved quickly in the other arena she knew well, perception. She had allies who specialized in spinning soft narratives into public relations defenses. Within 48 hours there were carefully placed leaks, an insinuation about a father's paranoia after a hectic travel schedule, a hint that a home had been misinterpreting discipline for cruelty, a suggestion that a tantrum-prone child had staged a scene to provoke reaction. The household staff whispered that someone had been paid to speak to a tabloid, but no one could be sure. He had to choose his battles. Public opinion could erode even the best legal claims. Private truth, if mishandled, could be weaponized. He shut down media access and instructed his counsel to request privacy for all hearings involving Sophia. He would not let a national audience reframe the story as the melodrama of a wealthy man being publicly shamed. That public campaign would be for another time. For now, the urgent work was to make sure Sophia was safe, to assemble a record that would survive both courtroom scrutiny and tabloid assault. The first affidavit from Carmen came in typed and notarized, the kind of small but formal stone thrown into a lake that made waves. Joao, the driver, signed a statement. Maria Helena corroborated. Mariana, the teacher, provided copies of drawings and dated notes. Dr.
Patricia's medical report arrived with a dryness that made his stomach tilt. Numbers and objective findings, descriptions that had the clinical finality of a diagnosis. He kept all of it in a file that he refused to call by any emotional name. He called it evidence. He also began to change other things. He canceled international flights that would have kept him gone for weeks. He rearranged his calendar for school plays and therapy sessions. He put in place supervised visits between Sophia and Letitia, not as punishment, but as a legal safety measure while the case unfolded. Letitia protested, of course. She accused him of trying to control the narrative, of weaponizing law to isolate her. She filed counterstatements suggesting parental overreach. She did not stop smiling on camera when she had to, but privately her voice had a steel to it. At night, when Sophia slept in a room that was no longer tidy in the same brittle way, but softened by the presence of small things he had bought, a stuffed rabbit, a new blanket, he read to her. He told stories about ordinary things, a train ride that had gone wrong, a man who learned how to make pancakes just the way someone else liked them. He told her that he would be there, and for once the promise felt like action and not a press release. Yet the legal future remained uncertain, which was both terrifying and necessary. The documents could show patterns but could not themselves heal. The medical reports could place facts into language but could not stitch the small hours together. The witness statements could create a tableau but could not undo nights spent hungry. Those things were beyond paper. They would be cured only by time and attention and the steady presence of adults willing to do the hard, slow work. And there were still more questions than answers. How long had this been allowed to happen? Who else had known? Was the house structured in a way that made it possible to hide such things? Staffly silences, doors that closed, rules enforced with a smile. He felt the corrosion of memory. There had been a time he noticed every scrap on a dinner table, every scraped knee of a toddler. Somewhere between shells of meetings and the maintenance of a life on display, he had retreated into the ledger of schedules and responsibilities and left someone in the spaces between. He did not indulge in recrimination for long. That would have been self-indulgence. Instead, he built a steady, practical schedule. Therapy appointments, school meetings, a rotation of staff vetted with questions that were specific rather than general. He installed discrete cameras in common areas after notifying counsel, not to entrap but to document. He learned uncomfortably how to sit in a room and simply be present for a small human. It was the hardest task he had ever set himself. Before filing for custody modifications, Dr.
Eduardo advised a cautious approach. Protective orders, medical and psychological assessments, a careful record of daily interactions. This was not a courtroom drama yet. It was a careful gardening of facts. He listened and acted on that guidance, and through the legal muscle he had cultivated over the years, he moved pieces on a chessboard that refused to seem like a game. The stakes were not prestige or money. They were a child's internal map of safety. Letitia did not accept the new terms easily. She hired counsel of her own and began to preempt the narrative with legal maneuvers and public statements designed to paint herself in a maternal light. The first leak alleged overreaction. The second suggested that a father's estrangement was being used to tarnish a woman trying to hold a family together. It was a familiar war, one waged best by the quiet and the loud at the same time. The house began to feel like a place where secrets had gravity. Doors closed differently, some with guilt, some with calculation. He found himself walking the corridors and noticing small, previously invisible signs, the way a light had been left on in a child's room to discourage wandering, the drawer with kid-sized socks neatly rolled, the small plate stacked under a cabinet where Sophia might have slipped food like contraband. Each discovery was a sting, a confirmation that absence could be weaponized by someone else's regime of control. But he began to learn the craft of presence. He mastered how to make a syrup-topped pancake and how to braid hair awkwardly yet tenderly. He learned how to sit through a child's tantrum without delegating it away. He learned how to let a small girl vent anger at the world without fixing it for her. He learned that sometimes the most healing thing he could do was to remain still and witness, even when words fell short. And through these small rituals, he began to see subtle changes. Sophia's drawings, once full of locked doors and small figures alone, began to scatter islands of color, birds here, a boat there. She learned to sleep without the knot in her jaw. She began to ask about things she had not asked before. The name of the park down the block, whether they could go get ice cream on a Sunday. Ordinary requests that carried with them the weight of recovery. Still, the public machine whirred. Letitia's counsel framed the father as irrationally controlling. The tabloids, hungry for the drama of wealth and scandal, ran reflexive pieces, more innuendo than fact. He felt that public eye like a low drone, one that amplified small mistakes and blurred nuance into caricature. He fought for privacy not because he feared the press, but because the press could turn truth into spectacle, and spectacle into a weapon. At a preliminary meeting, Dr. Eduardo told him to prepare for 2 wars. One would be legal, the paperwork, the hearings, the affidavits.
The other would be reputational, damage control, threads to be pulled out before they became knots. The first had tangible steps. The second was a kind of weather he could not fully predict. They needed both strategies. He continued to build his case with the terracing patience of someone who had learned to shape outcomes by shaping processes. He secured more statements from former staff. He arranged for Dr. Patricia to prepare a formal report. He scheduled the psychologist's assessment for a protected closed hearing, as Dr. Ana Lubia recommended, the kind of testimony designed to reduce trauma while preserving the child's voice for the court. Between one appointment and the next, he sat beside his daughter and read books in voices she found ridiculous. He made a tent out of sheets and rewarded her with pancakes with too much syrup. Letitia watched some of it with the smile of someone practicing an emotion in public. At other times, she watched with the stunned look of someone whose position of control was being eroded. She began, subtly, to shift from denial to indignation. Her counsel suggested counters, allegations of overreach, hints at instability in the household. He did not let them draw him into an angry public response. The hard, steady work was private and methodical. He guarded Sophia's schedule, took notes of everything that might look to the court like a pattern of neglect. He taped recordings of conversations when legally permissible, kept logs of feeding times, of locked doors he found in the night. He hired a child-centered security detail who knew how to be invisible when necessary and present when needed. The first tremor of a real turning point came when the psychologist's initial report arrived. It spoke not in the language of accusation, but in the exacting clinical terms of a child in need. There were observations of withdrawal, a pattern of avoidance when asked about certain times of the day, a repeated worry about not making noise. The report concluded with recommendations, immediate protective orders, structured therapy, and a controlled environment where Sophia could rebuild a sense of safety. It was not a sentence of guilt, it was a list of actions. He filed the documents. He did not make a speech. He wrapped Sophia in a blanket and told her a story about a little man who learned to listen. She fell asleep mid-sentence, the cadence of his voice a kind of stitch. Outside, the world began to murmur about the family. Inside the house, the work was slower and more human. He began to teach her the names of things again. He taught her to count with his fingers, to recognize seasons, to feel safe in the small rituals that make up ordinary life. He watched her as she ate what was put on her plate, and when she refused, he asked gently, without judgment. He learned to ask questions that were not tests. He learned to notice the silences. He was changing in ways that were messy and incremental.
He canceled a board meeting to attend a therapy session. He rescheduled a product launch because Sophia had a school recital she wanted him to attend. These were not declarations. They were new habits being installed inside daily life. It was a movement from image to responsibility, from a man who could be anywhere to a man who was choosing to be here, in the small and unphotographed rooms of a child's recovery. Yet tension held. The legal machinery would take time. Letitia's counsels were already arranging a public defense. The tabloids were sharpening their pens. There would be hearings, depositions, cameras kept at bay through legal petitions, but still looming like storm clouds. He could see the outline of it all, the courtroom, the measure of witnesses, the slow, bureaucratic ways of justice. He could imagine the ways the story could be perverted into something that obscured the child once again, that made her into a symbol instead of a person. One night, As rain sketched soft stripes down the windows, Sophia slid into his lap and said, simply, "I want pancakes tomorrow, the blue ones." It was the modest, brilliant claim of a small person reclaiming desire. He promised. He meant it. He was only beginning. The evidence lay before him. The people who could corroborate the story were lined up in statements and affidavits, and the medical reports had made the pattern visible. But the fight for what mattered most, the slow, private reclamation of a child's sense of safety, had only just started. He could feel the wind shift. He could feel the quiet war gather itself into motion, both inside his house and outside it, where perceptions and protections would clash. He closed the file that night and placed the drawings on top like a talisman. He did not sleep well. He woke early and called Dr. Eduardo and asked about next steps. The lawyer answered with a list: motions to secure a protective order, requests to the court for closed hearings, an appointment for the child psychologist to prepare testimony in a way that protected Sophia's privacy. Each task was a bolt in the fixture they were building. When he walked into the kitchen where Sophia was coloring at dawn, the bowl of kibble had been removed entirely. The house smelled faintly of coffee and orange peel. He sat down and watched her draw a sun with fewer lines. He watched her draw a small figure holding hands with someone much bigger. It was not the end, but the grip of something terrible had been loosened by the sheer force of attention, by the slow accretion of contract and care. Outside, a PR team had already suggested statements, counsels had prepared counters, and Letitia was drafting a narrative that would keep the story from entirely unraveling her image. The coming days promised legal hearings, media probes, and the careful work of a psychologist trying not to harm what she had been called to defend.
But in the small kitchen, with a child whose cheeks were already less hollow and a man who had learned, at last, how to make pancakes, there was a fragile, astonishing kernel of hope. He reached across the small table and took her hand, feeling the slight warmth there. "Blue pancakes tomorrow," he said. She nodded, satisfied. He wanted to believe that small promises could add up to something permanent. He had learned that restitution would not come from a check or a settlement. It would come from the accumulation of reliable mornings. He would need the law, the witnesses, the quiet evidence. He would need to hold firm against public spectacle and the cunning of someone determined to preserve their role in the house's story. He would need to change more than his calendar. He would need to change the habits that had allowed distance to feel like normal. That morning, as the city woke beyond the manicured hedges, he knew that the case would be long, that the legal and public battles would be messy, and that the deepest fight would be the slow, patient work of repairing a small life. He closed Sophia's coloring book, and for the first time in a long time, canceled a flight without a second thought. The world would have to wait. He would not. He closed the door to the study on a weekend that suddenly felt like a battleground, and sat at the desk that had always been for business. The files were no longer quarterly reports and merger notes. They were photographs and medical charts and witness statements. He opened one, and the printed words smelled faintly of the sterile world he was now inhabiting. Dates, times, observations. He read them the way he once read balance sheets, looking for patterns, anomalies, the numbers that would justify decisions. If this story is touching you, please leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. It helps remind us how many people care about the quiet lives behind the headlines. Dr. Eduardo outlined the next steps with the calmness of someone who had supervised storms before. "We request a closed hearing," he said. "We file for emergency custody. We ask for supervised contact pending the court's decision. We keep her out of the press. We do not let them use her image." His voice was exact. The plan sat like a keel under the worry. Practical, weight-bearing. They moved fast. The motion for protective custody was drafted that afternoon and filed the next morning. The request was short and steely. Immediate measures to ensure the child's safety. Medical evaluation. Closed proceedings to protect a minor. The paper sat between pens and a coffee ring as if law could be both a shield and a promise. Letitia's response came as the kind of practiced outrage that reads well in print. Her counsel accused the father of theater, of turning a private family dispute into a public spectacle. The counterstatement hinted at instability, that a child could be led by a parent into accusation for reasons of convenience. It was a familiar script in cases where perception matters as much as facts. Undermine the story, highlight motive, sow reasonable doubt. He had expected aggression. He had not expected how quickly advocacy could transform into a campaign.
Within days, there were whispers of late-night interviews, charged feeds with anonymous sources, a morning show appearing at the mansion gates, poking at the seams. He met with a small team, legal counsel, a privacy advisor, a child-centered PR consultant who made it her first rule to refuse spectacle. "We answer only in procedure," she told him. "We will not feed the beast. We will move documents, not quotes." There would be times when this would feel like an uneven fight. There would be nights when his inbox filled with slanted questions and anonymous attacks. But the documents themselves, the things that could stand under oath, were beginning to mount. Dr. Patricia's report, the psychologist's preliminary notes, Mariana's dated drawings, Carmen's sworn affidavit. Each piece was modest on its own. Together, they formed a net. When the judge, an even-handed woman whose voice suggested both authority and an impatience for drama, granted the emergency petition, the language was careful. The order established immediate protective custody to the father, supervised contact for Letitia pending further evaluation, and closed proceedings to protect the minor's identity. It did not resolve guilt. It created space for safety. It was enough, for the moment. Letitia left the house that day in an orderly way. Her departure had the theater of someone insisting on dignity while collecting luggage. She declared publicly that she would cooperate, and privately seethed. Her counsel moved quickly to request access, to argue for parental rights, to question the methods of evidence. A battle of processes began: depositions, subpoenas, requests for personnel records. It was legal choreography, in which each step was both movement and message. The first significant courtroom moment came in a sealed room 2 weeks later. The procedure was designed to protect the child's voice while allowing it to be heard by those who could act: judge, counsel, psychologist, and the child's father. The psychologist, Dr. Analua, had prepared Sophia for the setting: age-appropriate explanations, a room with soft light, a recorder that looked more like a toy than an instrument of state. Sophia was told she could take breaks, that no one expected her to use words she did not have. She was given a choice about who could be present. She chose her father. He watched from the back of the room, a silent adult folded into the chairs, feeling the weight of all the things that had been his absence. Sophia sat on a small chair beside the psychologist and answered questions with the bluntness of a child who had already learned how to reduce complicated things to concrete facts.
"I eat when they tell me to," she said at one point, and the sentence landed like a pebble in still water. The ripple was slow, arriving only after a moment of silent intake. The psychologist's testimony was methodical. She described patterns of behavior: hypervigilance, guarded responses, a tendency to minimize needs. She explained how drawings are often a child's language when words are too dangerous or difficult. She explained how to read a small hand's grip, not as dramatization, but as evidence of learned restraint. Her profession gave shape to what otherwise could be dismissed as subjective. Opposing counsel tried, as expected, to test the seams. He suggested alternative explanations: family disagreements, misunderstanding, overzealous parental interpretations. He asked about the timing of statements and whether the child might have been coached. The psychologist addressed each with the measured certainties of someone trained to spot influence and the absence of it. The child's drawings were dated, created across months. Notes correlated with school records and staff recollections. Statements were consistent before and after counsel's involvement. There was one crucible that turned on a detail small but decisive: a surveillance clip from a night months earlier. An unremarked grainy file from the house cameras in the hall showed the child waiting outside the kitchen door while a tray of food was being cleared. She hovered, small and patient, then retreated. The image added context to the drawings that had once looked like metaphor. The footage did not tell a story by itself, but it fit into the pattern that was being formed: times of restricted access, late-night hunger, small acts of hiding food. The ex-staff witnesses were called in sealed depositions. Carmen's voice was low but steady as she described the times she had slipped an extra sandwich into a drawer. João read aloud a report of seeing a small figure peeking out at night. Maria Helena recounted instructions she had been given about serving portions. Each account widened the frame. What had once been an anecdote in a kitchen now appeared as a sequence. Throughout, he tried to remain a father more than a litigator. He practiced restraint when cross-examined, listening to questions about his absence, owning them without apology, acknowledging the distance that had allowed harm to grow. It was a strange vulnerability for him, to admit that success had cost more than he thought, and to let reputation fade beneath the importance of protection. He could have attacked. He chose instead to build. The press, starved of ungoverned detail, turned to innuendo. The tabloid gossip anchored itself in the idea of a wealthy man pulled between duty and image. Some commentators wrote with a vitriolic ease that assumed motive without evidence. The father's phone filled with calls, some sympathetic, some not. He learned to let the noise remain noise.
He answered the calls he had to answer and deflected the rest. As the court process unfolded, the child's therapy sessions became the quiet center of daily life. They were not dramatic. They were hours of scaffolding, naming feelings, relearning trust, being allowed to ask for things and have the answer be yes. The psychologist used art and play and routines designed to let the child set the pace. He sat in the adjoining room on a chair, sometimes visible through glass, sometimes outside the building, always close enough for a walk home. He learned to be there without moving too quickly, to fill gaps with presence rather than words. There were moments of tender humility, the embarrassed pride of a father learning how to braid hair properly, the tentative triumph when Sophia admitted she liked a certain book he had chosen, the small ritual of tucking a note into her lunchbox that said simply, "I am coming back tomorrow." Those notes were not press releases. They were the soft architecture of repair. The legal skirmishes continued. Letitia's counsel produced character witnesses. They spoke of organized schedules and a disciplined household. They argued that firm rules did not equal cruelty. The father's team countered with patterns, testimonies and reports that showed those rules functioning as apparatus for control. Cross-examination became a matter of near forensic patient repetition, dates, meals, statements, photos. The courtroom had the sober cadence of an instrument trying to balance two kinds of truth, one that presented as care and one that revealed itself in small, repetitive deprivations. The hearing that would decide temporary custody and the terms of supervision was scheduled months later. By then, the public had taken its small bites out of both sides. Online threads debated motives. Opinion pieces argued legal philosophies in detached terms. But inside the sealed courtroom, a child's account and a child's medical chart mattered in ways that columns did not. Sophia's testimony in the sealed session was shorter than anyone might have expected, and yet more powerful. It wasn't a dramatic retelling. It was a child stating facts she had observed, answers she had practiced for the sake of being clear. When asked if she was hungry at times, she said, "Sometimes. I try not to make noise." When asked if anyone had told her not to eat, she looked at the psychologist and said simply, "Yes." The sentence slid like a thread through the air, small and intact. The judge's questions were calm and focused on protection more than punishment. She probed the family's routines, assessed the plausibility of the testimony, and summoned the medical reports. The legal language that followed was procedural: temporary custody to the father, continued supervised contact for Letitia pending further assessment, a mandate for a comprehensive family evaluation, and orders that any public commentary avoid naming the child or presenting her image. The decision did not resolve guilt in a final way, nor did it serve as a moral judgment. Rather, it was a mechanism to safeguard the child's immediate well-being while the slower wheels of the law turned. Letitia's departure from the home was final enough to mark a boundary. She contested the ruling, of course. There were further filings and motions. But the immediate effect was clear. The child had a secure base, and the legal system had placed its weight on creating distance between potential harm and a vulnerable child. Media attempts to paint the father as controlling and performative persisted, but the narrative of a man who began to reprioritize his life gained traction in quieter circles: school staff, pediatric networks, advocacy groups. A handful of commentators commended the privacy strategy and the emphasis on child-centered processes. It was not the same as exoneration. It was simply a reframing of what mattered. Back home, the house began to change in ways that had nothing to do with legal filings and everything to do with small domestic details. The rigid lines of previously curated spaces softened. Where there had been formal vases, there were now pots of cheap plastic plants Sophia had chosen at a nursery and insisted on placing on the windowsill. A basket of unbreakable plates replaced an arrangement of fine china in the family eating area. He installed child-height hooks for coats, moved a low table so colors would be more accessible, put a lamp in Sophia's reading corner so she would not be afraid of the dark. He also learned to negotiate his calendar. Meetings that once could not be missed now had flexibility, or they were handled by deputies. He learned to say no with fewer apologies. This did not mean the end of a career.
It meant the relocation of priorities. Some investments were simply reallocated toward what was irreducible. The healing did not move in a straight line. There were setbacks, nights when Sophia woke with nightmares and clung to him, mornings when she refused to eat out of fear of being denied seconds, a letter from a schoolmate's parent that quoted an online article she had read. There were also moments of luminous, ordinary success. First day back at a new after-school club where she raised her hand to ask a question, a birthday party with other children where she played and did not withdraw, the time she drew a sun with a single perfect circle in the middle and no protective lines around it. The father cultivated ritual as medicine. Pancakes on Sundays became a quiet covenant, blue pancakes on the day she wanted them, swirl pancakes another time, a small plate with a scribbled note sometimes tucked beside a bite of fruit. He created a bedtime routine with consistent storytelling and a promise jar where each small habit earned a slip that could later be traded for a special outing. They went to the park on Saturdays, sometimes to a museum, sometimes to nowhere in particular.
The point was not grand gestures, but the accruing of ordinary minutes. Privacy became a defensive posture he took seriously. He limited photographs online to no images of the child, refused interviews that would require her presence, and explained to staff the importance of confidentiality. He also redirected conversations away from the spectacle of scandal into the mundane work of parenting. Dental appointments, school conferences, the joy of being chosen for a class play. There was a relief in routine, life reorganized around a small, dependable access. Letitia's public statements, when they came, were measured and bitter. She insisted on versions of events that suggested misunderstanding and called for continued access. Her legal team remained active. There were gestures of reconciliation in the press, carefully framed, but the father, backed by the court's temporary orders and by the evidence that had been gathered, held the line on what the child needed most: time, stability, therapy. One of the more delicate decisions was whether and how to support a rehabilitative relationship between parent and former caretaker. The court encouraged structured, supervised family therapy with a specialist in attachment and trauma. The sessions were not about assigning roles of villain and hero. They focused on boundaries, safety, and the child's expressed needs. In a few sessions, Letitia attended, sometimes through counsel, sometimes with an insistence on preserving dignity. The sessions were uneven. Some felt constructive, others were defensive. The child's voice remained the centerpiece. She chose when to engage and when to observe. Progress was measured in inches. He leaned heavily on professionals. The psychologist prepared recommendations: sensory regulation techniques, a predictable schedule, therapeutic play, and cognitive behavioral strategies appropriate for a child of Sophia's age. There were also practical measures: a nutrition plan from a pediatric nutritionist, a pediatric follow-up schedule, and a school plan to monitor academic and social adjustments. Legal counsel monitored compliance and ensured that recommendations were translated into court-ordered actions where necessary. Gradually, the more visible public heat cooled. The tabloids moved on to the next scandal. But the quiet, persistent work continued. He sold a portion of his overseas holdings to fund a trust for education and therapy. He reorganized staff to ensure background checks, regular reviews, and an open line to a trusted house counselor who would act as a point person for the child's comfort. He stayed home when he could, and when he could not, he made sure a familiar face sat with Sophia, a teacher, a close friend of the family, a vetted nanny, so that continuity did not fracture. As months passed, the drawings evolved in ways that felt like a catalog of recovery. Locks became small dotted lines.
Figures in rooms started to touch each other, even if the hand-holding was tentative. She drew parks, ice cream cones, a crooked house with a cat in the window. Once she made a picture of a tall man and a small girl, both smiling. He kept it on the fridge. There were also practical changes in the household that mattered. The kitchen rules were rewritten collaboratively and in age-appropriate language. Snacks were made accessible in a low cabinet, so a child did not have to wait for permission to eat when hungry. Mealtimes became predictable and social. The child's preferences were given voice and choice. He learned to ask rather than presume. He learned that loving attention must be operationalized into systems and schedules that respect a child's autonomy. He also made private commitments. He attended support groups for parents dealing with trauma in children, read recommended books, took workshops about attachment, and began to see a counselor himself to work through the guilt that threatened to become immobilizing. The counselor taught him how to hold accountability without self-derision, to accept that absence had played a role, without letting it define his capacity to act now. A turning point arrived, not in court, but in a school auditorium. The small play was nothing that should have been a watershed.
3 minutes of lines and 2 dances. Yet as Sophia stepped onto the stage and found her voice, every yesterday folded. He watched her in the dim light as she recited a single line, unflinching. When the curtain fell, she ran into his arms, breathless and triumphant. It felt less like victory than like permission to be delighted without punctuating it with fear. The legal processes continued in the background. Depositions, evaluations, a custody review, each with its own bureaucratic rhythm. The father's team remained prepared, methodical. They did not relish a war, but they were not naive about the nature of adversarial systems. They kept the focus narrow, the child's welfare. Letitia's legal strategy evolved to push for increased access, for measures that would preserve her parental rights. The father's team agreed to certain forms of contact, framed through supervised visitation and therapeutic sessions designed to assess the child's comfort and attachment responses. In that arena, neither side truly won quickly. They were engaging in a long negotiation orchestrated by professionals and presided over by a court that refused spectacle. The months accrued legal papers. There were nights when he read them in bed under a reading lamp, fatigue and resolve braided together. There were mornings when he woke early to drive Sophia to therapy, coffee in the thermos, a picture book waiting in his passenger seat. There were small traditions that became anchors, a Saturday stop at the bakery for a pastry Sophia could choose, a bedtime ritual of 3 stories, one silly, one real, one that made room for questions.
Community began to step in, not in the form of headline-grabbing charity, but through small acts from people who saw the child as a neighbor rather than a story. The teacher checked in more often, arranging peer playdates. A local librarian suggested a reading group. The pediatric clinic provided sliding fee follow-ups and referred the family to a social worker who helped with school transitions. Those gestures reinforced an important truth. Healing rarely happens in isolation. Time, paired with attention, made space for small joys. The father taught her to ride a bike without training wheels. He made mistakes, letting go too soon or too late, and they both learned. They celebrated holidays with a mix of new and careful rituals that honored the child's earlier life without forcing memories she might not be ready to hold. He learned to ask about Clara, the woman who had once cared for Sophia, and to allow the child to remember in her own terms. They discussed adoption in simple, honest ways, framing family around care and presence rather than bloodline. At one point, in a quiet conversation, Sophia asked a question that surprised him with its simplicity. "Will you always be here?" Her voice was not accusatory. It was a child seeking the constancy that trauma had unsettled. He answered not with grand promises, but with practice. He rearranged a few more things. He took a lower-level position on a board so he could be home, leaving the company stronger for that choice rather than weaker. He learned the art of small, repeated affirmations, attending recitals, saying yes to minor outings, not letting work be the default escape. He found that some careers allowed recalibration without collapse. He learned to move within them. By the time the court revisited custody matters, the record was layered. Medical charts, psychological evaluations documenting progress under the father's care, testimonies about improved routines, and a child who showed signs of resilience. The judge, mindful of a child's developmental trajectory, extended the orders that favored stability, continued primary custody with the father, supervised access for Letitia conditioned on therapy and observed sessions, and mandatory family counseling. The ruling was cautious, crafted to allow healing without permanent prejudice, while protecting the current equilibrium the child needed. Letitia appealed portions, requested more access, and publicly called for mediation. The battles were not yet over, but the immediate danger that had sent him into the kitchen that night months ago had been contained. The law does not erase harm, it simply creates an environment where repair can begin. The last scene of the legal arc was not a courthouse parade, but a small settlement of logistics. Therapy schedules confirmed, visitation plans signed, privacy orders reaffirmed. He closed that file the way one closes many files now, practical, attentive, then placed it away.
The heavy weight of it had been redistributed into small daily responsibilities. What followed was not a tidy moral victory. It was the ongoing, stubborn labor of parenting. There were visits where Sophia returned from supervised contact unsure and quiet. There were days when the headlines revisited the story and the child had to be shielded from stray questions. There were weeks when progress was invisible. But there were also countless luminous, ordinary moments. A card she made for him that said, "Thank you for being here," a shared joke, a new school friend invited to sleep over, an evening where she asked for a second helping without looking to see if permission would be granted. In private, he admitted to himself that he would always carry a particular kind of regret, the kind that sits alongside gratitude. He had been fortunate in many ways: resources to secure counsel, the privilege of choice. He had also been late to what mattered most. That admission did not sap resolve, it sharpened it. It turned into an ethic of presence. There were practical lessons he spread beyond his home. He met quietly with a group of benefactors who managed shelters and childhood welfare organizations to discuss funding for programs that trained household staff and caretakers to identify and report signs of neglect. He supported school programs on trauma-informed classrooms. He used resources where they could do the most good without fanfare. It was still part of his public life, but now it bent toward prevention rather than image. The final image of the months that followed was not a headline or a courtroom pronouncement. It was a late afternoon at the small community park near their house. Sophia sat on a swing, hair catching the light, feet pumping high. He pushed gently from behind, steady and sure. She laughed when the wind hit her face, the ease of joy returning in small increments. He watched her and felt the delicate balance of gratitude and vigilance. At home, they had a new ritual each night, 3 small things from the day they were grateful for, written on slips and dropped into a jar. They did not always have big things to record. Often they wrote simple truths: ice cream, blue pancakes, a hug. The jar grew heavy with ordinary gladness, a slow inventory of life reclaimed. He knew the road ahead would require ongoing attention. The legal system might still examine aspects of the family's past. Public curiosity could flare in cycles, and the child's healing would be a lifetime of small acts. But the child's immediate safety was assured. There was daily evidence of repair: a fuller cheek, a drawing with more colors, a bedtime cuddle that replaced a locked door. When asked by a friend if he felt vindicated by the court's decisions, he paused. "This was never about vindication," he said. "It was about making a place safe enough for a child to remember how to want."
His voice carried the simple humility of someone who had learned the hard arithmetic of priorities. In the month that followed, Sophia's laughter returned like a small, recurring weather. He watched it with the careful attention of someone who knew fragility could be disguised as resilience. He taught her to fish with a small rod one Saturday afternoon. He held the line with equal parts steadiness and tenderness, letting the child feel the tug herself before offering help. She returned home with a soggy shoe and a triumphant grin. He knew the victories would be of that type: damp shoes, sticky fingers, a child who could claim delight. The house still bore the marks of the time, not in the form of scars, but as rearranged furniture and policies and soft new rituals. The portrait that once hung in the foyer remained tucked in a drawer for now. Sometimes late at night he would take it out and look at it, at the way a camera had once arranged smiles. He did not need to burn memory to make room for progress. He simply needed to be present enough to let the future be different. One evening, after a particularly ordinary dinner, Sophia handed him a drawing she had made in school. It was a simple scene: a small figure and a taller figure under a sun, both smiling. The sun had fewer lines this time. He felt the weight of the paper and the quiet of the room around him, thick with the normal sounds of life: a dishwasher hum, a distant television turned low. And he felt gratitude that was less about absolution and more about responsibility accepted. He folded the drawing and put it in his wallet, a small private talisman. He had learned that repair was not a single dramatic act, but a chain of small, dependable mornings. He had shifted his life in a way that would be visible in choices: canceled trips, reworked calendars, a new set of habits that prioritized a child's presence over a public measure of success. Outside, the city continued to turn. Inside, a man who had once justified absence with busyness had become someone who let presence define him. The legal battles would continue in less dramatic forms: documents and counsel and hearings that would occasionally call for stamina. But the urgent danger had been removed, and the child had a place that honored both protection and play. The last scene closes as simply as the first discovery began. In a kitchen. Not the cold, clinical night of the kibble, but a morning painted soft with light. Sophia stood on a stool and stirred cereal into a bowl. She smiled without looking up. Confident. He made coffee and sat across from her, feeling the ordinary hum of breakfast. She reached across the table and took his hand in a small, unadorned gesture of trust.
They had not fixed everything. They never would. Healing in this story was not a tidy finale, but a daily practice.
Still, in that modest kitchen, with the city waking beyond the windows and a jar of gratitude already half full, he felt a kind of ongoing promise. He had found his way back to the thing that mattered most, not as a headline and not as a badge of virtue, but as a consistent presence in a small life that had once been quietly diminished. If this story moved you, share it to raise awareness of how critical safety and attention are for children in all households. In the description, you'll find links to child protection resources and helplines if you or someone you know needs support. Support the quiet work of protecting and healing, one ordinary morning at a time.